In the last episode, we examined the evolution of the Zara spook, and we finished by showing a clip of one of my homemade spook imitations getting hit by a big dolomew. Let's return to that morning, a few minutes before that big bass smashed my lure. I've caught a lot of bass over the years, but this one is special because it's the first topwater bass I ever recorded on my GoPro camera. I'm showing off the homemade imitation yellow perch plug I caught it on and demonstrating it in action, wiggling on the surface. Now we fast forward a moment and make a cast to cover the shallow water. Nothing there. Let's try out a little deeper. Now, how often in your life can you point to your spot, cast to it, and then hook a giant smallmouth on video on your own homemade lure? Welcome to the Basstravaganza. This is a new lure hitting the water for the first time this morning. I have to say, it seems to have potential. As you can see by the sad end of that clip, the bass spits the plug out and gets away. That's a pretty common occurrence in my life. Welcome to the Basstravaganza. Now, before we continue with this morning's fishing, let's backtrack a little to review how I got to this point. The store-bought Zara spook is a really effective lure at certain times under particular conditions. This is an imitation of the classic Head spook made by another company, and you can see that it catches fish too. When you look closely from a fish's point of view, a spook doesn't resemble anything you might see in nature. Notice that the most visible thing the fish sees is the company name and the product trademark. I've often thought that it must be possible to improve on this historic lure. So a few years ago I carved some lures out of cedar and weighted them in the tail like spooks. And they got hit too. I remember this morning when I got over 30 surface hits, including a couple nice rainbows. How often do you get surface hits on a big topwater plug from rainbow trout? Now, I have to make another digression here. So the wood that I built these lures out of was not ordinary cedar like you'd buy in a lumber yard. It comes from a tree that grew in the Cypress Bay region on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And it's pretty well known in the world of bass fishing that there are some special chemicals in the ground there that give the wood from Cypress River a unique smell or aroma or some special chemical signature that is basically irresistible to fish. And that's why I call it Super Cypress Cedar. Anyway, I started modifying the typical shape of the spook. I added primitive gills into a few lures. The flared gills make more splash when you jerk the plug along the surface. And that worked too. It's like a Zara spook with flared gills, so I call it a Zara fluke. It caught some big fish, and it still does. But I wanted to try something more realistic, so I downloaded images of fish from the internet, and then I carved shapes from Super Cypress Cedar to match them and painted them to resemble local fish that the bass might feed on. I began modifying the basic torpedo shape of the classic lure to something that looks more like a fish. The four on the left are yellow perch, with a bass and a pumpkin seed sunfish imitation on the right. Here's a closer look at the perch pattern. These lures were weighted with lead in the stern like a classic Zara spook, and they generated a lot of strikes. And this lure is still in my tackle box. This is a big pike minnow. the fish that used to be called squawfish, from a Soyuz Lake surface hit on that same perch plug. I even caught a few nice fish on this crude largemouth bass imitation. Noticed that there was a tiny tree frog hitchhiking a ride around the lake on my pontoon boat that day. But I wasn't satisfied. I wanted to target big bass, so I decided to make a bigger lure. I called it the Mega Perch. I removed the rear hook and replaced it with a marabou tail, and then added a bit of orange marabou to imitate the orange pectoral fins of a perch. With its tail full of lead, this lure weighed as much as a small brick. It was too heavy to throw with my normal bass fishing gear. If I didn't use at least 15-pound test line, it would just break the line off on the back cast. And if I used heavier line, I risked snapping off the end of my rod when I tried to make a cast. So I rigged up a 7.5-foot rod with heavy line, and with that combination, I could cast the Mega Perch out to an enormous distance. So I started to specialize in a form of bass fishing that maybe nobody has ever tried before, casting these huge surface plugs out to extreme distance. And the Mega Perch got some tremendous strikes. It met its sad demise in a Soyuz Lake. I got a crushing hit and my Mega Perch lure disappeared into this gigantic boil, and it started heading south toward the U.S. border, and it never stopped. It was probably one of those ogapogos they have around there. Anyway, that winter I decided to try to improve my plan. I wanted to switch to a single triple hook, because when you hook a fish in the lip with a standard store-bought lure, you'll often foul hook it on the other hooks as it thrashes around. You snag it in the eye or the gills or the belly, and I wanted to avoid that, so I switched to a single hook, even if it means I catch less fish. Now, bass attack head on, so if you have more than one hook on your lure, you're probably going to hook that bass on the front hook. So I removed the triple hook from the tail of my lures. And I didn't like the phony marabou tails and fins I had fabricated the previous summer. They looked stupid, and they quickly got torn apart anyway whenever a big fish hit. I wanted something more realistic and more durable. Now, you remember our hero Kekule from a previous show. Now, that winter I decided to expand my lure materials from wood and lead and nail polish, and I wanted to learn a little bit more about how to use plastic. So I Googled around and I bought a couple products to test. One of them is called Alumisol. Kekule would call it a heat-activated polyurethane soft plastic. It comes as a liquid. And you heat it up and pour it into a mold, and it gels into the shape of a mold. Now, I bought it to try to make rubber worms, and it worked really well, so I decided to try using Alumisol to make fish tails. Now, I'll go into more detail about this process on a future show. Suffice it to say that I was really pleased with the results I came up with. If I was a younger man, I would scrap everything and devote my entire life to making tails for fish lures. Here's some video from my secret underground high-tech lure testing facility, which also doubles as my bathtub. It shows what a pair of store-bought lures look like from a fish's point of view. A Rapala and a Zara spook. And then one of my lures, a perch-flavored imitation of a Zara spook, with the triple hook replaced by one of my custom tails made from Alumisol. Of course, looking good in a bathtub or on the shelf in a sporting goods store is one thing. Fooling bass is another. So I want to show this short clip. I've been working on these lures all winter, and I happened to be in the Okanagan in April, and I was at Soyuz Lake, and I'd launched my pontoon boat. I was planning to go out fishing with rubber worms, and at that time these lures had never touched any body of water bigger than a bathtub. So I had this one tied on my bigger rod, and I went down and stood on the shore and just flipped it in the water. I didn't cast, I just flipped it out, and I wanted to twitch it back and see what it looked like. And I couldn't believe how realistic it looked, just wiggling back along the surface. It looked just like a live little fish. And then something even more unbelievable happened, because right about 10 feet off the end of the pontoon on my pontoon boat, a big smallmouth bass rolled over and swallowed it. The first time it ever touched the water. So my GoPro camera was up on the front seat in my car in its charger. So I held the rod with one hand and I went running up to my car, and I reached in with my one hand. I was able to disconnect the GoPro and actually press the right buttons and turn it on and get it turned on. And that's when I shot this video. So you see, I'm holding the rod with one hand, and I'm holding the video camera back here with the other. And as you can see, the fish spit my hook out and got away, but still, that's a pretty auspicious baptism for any lure. So let's head back out to Shawnigan Lake, where I just lost that big fish, and do some more field testing of my rubber-tailed spook. Now I'm using an 8.5-foot salmon rod rigged up with 30-pound line. Just a little flip of this huge rod will throw the plug out an enormous distance. And it doesn't take long before I have another hit. This one's nowhere near as big as the last one, but it's still a decent fish. It's way different from the 6-foot rod I usually use for bass. It's like running one of those giant cranes that lift containers onto ships, except that this container has a bad attitude. You can see the lure I'm throwing. It's made of super cyper cedar, and I often repeat that name as a kind of mantra in respect to the ancient cedars that grow in Cypress Bay.
Super cyper cedar.
And here it looks like I'm throwing my plug out into deep water. But I know a little secret. There's a big underwater rock pile out there, and there's another nice bass lurking on top of it. The fish I'm after are known as smallmouth bass for a reason. Because they have small mouths. For a fish, anyway. So it's obviously difficult to hook fish that have small mouths on these big wooden plugs. With smallmouth bass, a big lure usually just bounces out of their jaws before you can set the hook. I measured this one. It was 17 inches. Now, one advantage of making super long casts is that you can make super long retrieves. So the fish have a long time to get a good look at your lure. Now, if you have a normal lure, this is actually a disadvantage because the fish will inspect it and then they'll laugh at the phony piece of crap you're throwing at them. But if you have a lure made of super cyper cedar that looks like a real fish, sometimes the wily bass just can't believe it's not real. Watch how long I have to walk my dog across the water. You can see the seconds counting off. Most topwater lures would get hit within seconds, or not at all. There could have been a big bass nosing right along under this lure, following it all the way back to the boat, and you'd never know it unless it explodes right on the plug. Which it just did. Another nice smallie. Welcome to the Basstravaganza. Every big bass on Vancouver Island has probably been caught and released by anglers multiple times. So they're no strangers to hooks piercing their lips. It's like those crazy kids today. They all want to get pierced noses or eyebrows or tongues. It only hurts for a moment and then you're a cool cat. So I like to think I'm doing my part to keep the bass population hip. It's probably a badge of honor to be able to strut around down in their bass holes and tell their fellow bass that they got their lip pierced by Humpty Dumpling and they got to be a movie star and pose for the Basstravaganza. Well, this seems to be working. Let's try again. Most topwater fishermen throw their lures right close to shore, but these huge plugs probably scare the heck out of most fish in shallow. I often have better luck throwing them out over deeper water, where fish seldom see a surface lure. There may be a bass following my lure like a cop tailing a car, running the license plate through their computer and checking the record on this lure before they turn on the flashers and make a bust. This one takes so long to make up its mind that I'm just about ready to give up on this cast and start picking my nose when it finally decides to bite. Another super cyper cedar plug apprehended by the long arm of the law, or the small mouth of the bass.
Super cyber cedar.
Now, if you don't mind, just swim into the net and pose for the Basstravaganza. And then you can be on your way. Well, that's two nice fish off the same rock pile. And it's been a pretty successful test of the beta version of the Alumisol tails.
Yes, sir. Super cyber cedar.
I think I'll call it a day. Let's try another lake, and sie wat wie shall see.
17.5.
Here's a shot that gives you a closer look at my lure. This is from Langford Lake,
Missed the strike
a few days later.
because I muffed the camera again. Caught on cyper super cedar.
Notice the floppy tail. Let's give this fat pig a hearty welcome to the Basstravaganza. Well, that was a nice bass. Now let's try another lake. This morning we head out to Quesnel, one of my favorite local lakes here in Nanaimo. A sip of hot coffee to take the edge off the morning chill, and we are underway. It's still early May. Soon the male bass will be claiming territory and scouring out their nests in preparation for the spring spawning season. So there should be lots of fish in shallow water. For you folks out in video land, it's one fish after another, but it's not like that in the real world. It usually takes many blank casts before you get a bite at all. And most of the fish that bite either miss the hook or shake off before I can get them to the boat. The best time for throwing topwater plugs is almost always early in the morning or late in the evening. And my favorite time is around dawn. I love being on the water as the sun is coming up. It's a very quiet time in the human world, but a very busy one for birds and bugs and fish. And even if the fish aren't biting, I love just being out on the water in my silent, customized, electric-powered pontoon boat. I call it the Stealth Bomber. There's a hit, but it's only a dinker. hardly much bigger than the lure it's chasing. With this huge rod, I can flick my wrist and throw the lure out so far that sometimes it lands in another time zone. I know my lure is out there somewhere, but I have trouble seeing it against the morning sunrise. And today, I'm throwing new lures that are hitting the water for the first time ever. Not to worry though. Bingo, another hit. And this one is hooked. Now that is some long-range bass fishing. Reeling in fish from this far away gives them lots of opportunity to shake the hook and get away. Quesnel Lake isn't named after the gold rush town of Quesnel in the interior of BC. It's named after Edward Quesnel, who was born in England and came to Nanaimo to work in the coal mines in 1864. After a few years, he made enough money to buy some land around this lake. He raised cattle here and drove them into Nanaimo, where he had a butcher shop. His business prospered and he became mayor of Nanaimo. You should always have needle nose pliers ready. That way you can remove the hook and get the bass back into the water quickly and with minimal pain and damage. Bass are really tough fish, and they can be caught and released over and over again if you do it right.
Super Cyper Cedar.
It's a good idea to retie a new knot after you've caught a good fish. Because I put so many hours of work into creating each one of these lures, I'm a fanatic about my knots. I start with 10 or 12 feet of 20-pound test clear fluorocarbon leader tied on to the braided main line, and I lose a few inches off that every time I retie. When the leader starts to get too short for my liking, I cut it off and tie on a new one. This lake drops off almost vertically to 10 or 15 feet along most of the shoreline, so you want to throw right up against the bank in most places. And there's another good hit. Swing and a miss. One thing I like about my stealth bomber, aside from the obvious advantages it provides for fishing, is that I can often get up real close to wild critters that would flee from another boat. Even the noise and motion of oars and paddles scares wild animals away. But sometimes other critters seem to be just as curious about my boat as I am about them. Sometimes I'd just as soon sit and watch the universe unfold around me as to fish. Here's a mama deer with her little fawn. If I was in a motorboat or even a rowboat, they'd probably be long gone already. But the stealth boat is non-threatening. Just a twitch of my fingertips on the handle of my electric motor is all the movement I need in order to creep up on them. That fawn seems to be checking out my lure. I wonder if it will bite on it. I've never caught a deer on rod and reel, but there's always a first time, right? Well, not today. Super Cyper Cedar seems to be more attractive to fish than it is to ungulates. This little fawn seems to be more interested in getting a bit of milk from Mama, but Mama will have none of that. Go find your own meal, kid, and don't go biting on that idiot's fishing lure either. Sometimes the bass will jump on the lure the moment it hits the water. Other times, they want to check it out for a long time, just to make sure it's a real bait fish and not some fake tossed out on the water by a human trying to fool them. But they have never seen my lure, because this is the first time it has ever hit the water. Now, if you throw out a lure made of cyper cedar, the fish will smell it instantly, and they may swim all the way across from the other side of the lake just to bite on it. So it might take a while. Watch how long this fish follows the plug before it finally decides to crush it. It looks tiny because it's jumping so far away on a wide-angle lens, but it's actually a pretty good fish. The morning sun is glowing like a blowtorch. What a privilege it is to live in a place where there's a beautiful lake and a quality fishery like this, only minutes away from the 100,000 people who live just over the hill. I need to use the electric motor to lead it away from the lily pads. Another nice Quenelle smallie, and another beautiful morning on the water. But the sun is getting high and the dawn bite is dying off. So I'm going to hurry back to the boat launch, load out and drive home.
This is the first fish ever brought to the net on this lure.
In time to watch Leave It to Beaver on TV.
Great big heavy nail. Nice fish. The rainbow trout. Super Cypher Cedar.
Well, it looks like we're out of time again. Be sure to stay tuned for the next episode of the Basstravaganza.